Black media only exists because of you, so be sure to give the video a like and share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. After the last crime report, one of which dealt with an 80-year-old rapist in the Walker Sheriff's County Department, a few people have been asking about another recent incident of lawlessness in Georgia. Specifically, the former DA of Brunswick, Georgia, Jackie Johnson. You'll recall that Jackie Johnson was the crooked DA who deliberately tried to bury the Ahmaud Arbery murder. Now, she became the DA there in 2010 when then-Governor Sonny Perdue appointed her to the job. And through the power of incumbency, she's been able to hold on to that position because no one was able to mount a substantive challenge to her. But we see what she's been doing all these years. One of the criminals who worked in Jackie Johnson's office was none other than Gregory McMichael, the father of fellow Ahmaud Arbery murderer Travis McMichael. Gregory McMichael had been a so-called investigator with the Brunswick DA's office from 1995 until he retired from his life of courtroom crime in 2019, only a few months before he murdered Ahmaud Arbery. We can only imagine how many innocent black people that piece of trash framed for crimes they didn't commit, or how many killings and other crimes that Gregory McMichael covered up. On February 23, 2020, Gregory McMichael, along with his inbred oaf of a son, chased down Ahmaud Arbery and murdered him in cold blood. There were at least 16 phone calls between Gregory McMichael and Jackie Johnson from the day of the murder up until early May, and who knows how many personal meetings McMichael had with her, or emails, or how many intermediary communications they had using third parties. The first phone call between McMichael and Johnson occurred on February 23rd, only an hour after he'd murdered Ahmaud Arbery. He murdered Ahmaud Arbery, and his very first call was to the DA. Now, who does that? He knows he committed a crime, and he felt like he could confide in Jackie Johnson that she wouldn't rat him out, that he can tell her he committed a murder and she wouldn't do anything about it. And he was right. The fix was in from the jump. The message that Gregory McMichael left for Johnson was only 39 seconds, so prosecutors believe that most likely was just a voicemail. But whatever it was that Gregory McMichael put in that 39-second phone call, it was enough for her to know exactly what had happened, exactly who it happened to, and exactly what it was that she needed to do next to derail the course of justice. The cover-up of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery was clearly a maneuver that the racists in that area had practiced many times before. Only a few hours after the murder, while the police were still working the crime scene, Jackie Johnson was already contacting a friend of hers, George Barnhill Sr., who was the district attorney of Wayne Cross Circuit, and she asked him if he would go to meet with the local authorities in Glenn County and to advise with them on the case. She did this without even conducting an investigation. This was what she did in the first hours following the murder. And she did this right after her pal McMichael called her. Now, why would Jackie Johnson contact this George Barnhill person anyway? Why him in particular? What made him so special? Probably because Barnhill's son, who's also named George, worked in Jackie Johnson's office as an assistant DA for 7 years up until that point and was still on the payroll. And George Barnhill Jr. also worked with George McMichael on cases, so the two thugs knew each other. I mean, the ties between these white supremacist trash are just incestuous. Does anyone believe that Barnhill Sr., the Wayne Cross Circuit DA, forgot that his own son was employed by the very same Jackie Johnson who was calling him up? And that apparently Barnhill forgot that his own son had also worked with Gregory McMichael? And apparently Jackie Johnson forgot all about that also, right? And neither Johnson nor Barnhill saw this as a conflict of interest. Does anyone believe that? I guess that's why Jackie Johnson had Barnhill Jr. act as a go-between for herself and other people involved in this case. You'll also notice that he left the Brunswick DA's office at the end of 2020, a little over 6 months after the McMichaels were arrested for murdering Ahmaud Arbery. You see, following the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, it became obvious to a lot of the thugs in blue and their fellow travelers and supporters in these prosecutors' offices that it wasn't going to be business as usual for white supremacist killers. Anyway, back to Barnhill Sr., the corrupt DA of Waycross Circuit. The very next day after the Arbery murder, Barnhill met with the local authorities in Glenn County, and Barnhill immediately decided that he wouldn't be seeking any charges. He claimed that Ahmaud Arbery attacked the very white men who murdered him. So you have one corrupt racist DA who covers for another racist corrupt DA. This is the very definition of collusion, plain and simple. It's nepotism, cronyism, and patronage all rolled into one stinking inbred ball of murder and lies. The conflicts of interest here for all parties involved are so overwhelming it's not even a question. The reason that Jackie Johnson did this is because this is what prosecutors routinely do in order to escape the accusation of corruption. They call up one of their buddy prosecutors who they're all on the same page with, and they ask this person who they have an understanding with to pretend that they're going to handle the investigation, because they've got an understanding with each other. That way, when people inevitably point out that Jackie Johnson refused to prosecute because her friend McMichael committed the murder, Jackie Johnson can falsely claim that she recused herself from the case and it was being handled by a quote-unquote outside agency. When the truth is, she asked her corrupt buddy Barnhill to do her a favor. And even then, Jackie Johnson was still fully hands-on with her efforts to cover up this murder. 3 days after Arbery was murdered, Jackie Johnson called the Georgia Attorney General's office, allegedly to ask them to appoint an outside prosecutor to oversee the case. And you won't be surprised to learn that Jackie Johnson already knew exactly who she thought should be handling this case. As the legal filing against Johnson pointed out, she called a paralegal in the state attorney general's office and said that Barnhill had already accepted the case. But as the legal filing also points out, Johnson failed to disclose that Barnhill had already reviewed the case and declared the case to be self-defense. Thus, Johnson effectively chose the outcome of the case despite having a conflict. So how is this recusing herself from the case? She's actively rigging it and stage directing it like a high school play. She's in total nonstop contact with all the major players in this crime. From the killers to the person she wants to investigate it, even though he's already assured her he's not going to bring any charges, all the way up to the state attorney general's office, who she wants to certify this judicial fraud to make it seem official. These are the lengths that Jackie Johnson went to protect the trash who she knew had committed a cold-blooded murder. But here's my question. How was she so sure that the state attorney general's office wasn't going to come and bite her on the behind for this? How was she so certain that they would allow her to dictate to them who she thought ought to handle this case? Once you ask for a special prosecutor, isn't the matter supposed to be out of your hands? So why was Jackie Johnson so sure that she wouldn't come under suspicion herself for going to the state attorney general's office and then trying to cherry pick who handles the case? Why was she so confident that it would work? Obviously, because this isn't the first time that the Georgia Attorney General's office has acted as accessories to murder and allowed some DA to help bury a murder case before. This wasn't their first rodeo. In the 2 months that followed the Ahmaud Arbery murder, his killers and their accomplices in the DA's offices thought that they had gotten away with it. Since they were the prosecutors, they figured there was no one who was going to hold them accountable. It's not like the white media was looking to put a spotlight on these racial murders. In fact, the white media had tried to ignore the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, but people in Georgia were talking, especially black people, and were raising these questions and weren't letting them die. And that was when the attorney for one of Arbery's murderers leaked, quote-unquote, the video of the murder. As they figured, they thought the video would somehow exonerate them. After all, the 2 prosecutors in that area had already said, well, we think it's self-defense. This is what happens when you live on a steady diet of stupid. That is, Fox News. Now, as black people, we know exactly why it is that they thought that this was going to exonerate them. Because their ambush and murder of Ahmaud Arbery was exactly how George Zimmerman murdered Trayvon Martin. So they thought if Zimmerman could initiate a confrontation, assault someone, and then make a phony claim of stand your ground after he killed them, why, they could do the same thing too. They already had the DAs say we're on your side. And they were right. But what those inbred hayseeds didn't understand was this wasn't 2013. Things had changed since then because the grassroots were changing them. There was public focus and public pressure on these crimes now, and the prosecution of these crimes could be taken out of Jackie Johnson and George Barnhill's corrupt little hands. Soon the heat got so hot that on April 3rd, George Barnhill Sr., after months of defending the murder of Ahmaud Arbery as being perfectly legal, suddenly remembered that his son worked in Jackie Johnson's office, so now he suddenly felt the need to recuse himself from the Arbery case altogether. Amazing how public pressure improves the memory of some public officials. But apparently Jackie Johnson's memory was still failing her, because when she found out Barnhill had jumped ship, that evening at 6:25 p.m., she called Gregory McMichael yet again. And this time it wasn't a voicemail. The two of them talked for nearly 3 minutes about the case. And that wasn't the last time that those two would talk either. In the weeks to follow, they would each call each other back and forth and continue to stay in contact. And that's just the phone records. The final known phone contact between Jackie Johnson and Gregory McMichael happened on May 5th, 2020. McMichael called Johnson twice late that night. He left a voice message for her, thanking her for having recommended what lawyer he should hire. Gregory McMichael said, "He's going to run interference for me right now, and that's damn good advice, and I appreciate that very much." So this skank Jackie Johnson was acting as legal aid for this killer. She was trying to choose who the prosecutor would be and the defense attorney. This is important for you to remember, because this is what we as the black media talk about when we say that these court cases are kangaroo courts. It's rigged, and they're all in on it. The white media won't tell you this. They keep pushing and repeating the lie that the prosecutors, the judges, and the defense attorneys are all independent actors who just happen to be in the same courtroom at the same time, and when some white supremacist murderer walks, why? That's because the case just wasn't strong enough. I mean, who can understand these things? It's all a mystery. It certainly can't be because these scumbags are operating with an open racial bias. But as you've seen in the last few years, now the cover is being pulled back, and you're seeing exactly how these miscarriages of justice happen. It's just like the murder of Breonna Taylor, isn't it? Daniel Cameron tried to use the secrecy of the grand jury to bury a case that he didn't want to prosecute, and then he tried to hide behind the grand jury and blame them for it. Only that time the grand jury made it clear they weren't taking the fall for him, and they fought in court to have their say, which they did. Though you'll notice that there is no Democrats who are calling for Cameron to be indicted or who are running against him on a platform of reopening the Breonna Taylor case. That's because it's the Democrat DAs like Bob McCullough who used the grand jury trick to derail the prosecution of Darren Wilson after he killed Michael Brown, and other Democrat DAs like Anita Alvarez in Chicago. Both political parties operate out of the same playbook. What Jackie Johnson did was simply a variation on the grand jury trick, except in her case, she couldn't afford to let this go to a grand jury. She had to kill the investigation before it got that far. Though she knew she couldn't do it alone, so she called some of her other corrupt legal buddies, and they were going to try to keep this one in-house. Jackie Johnson was never recused from this case. She was neck deep in it every single step along the way, from the very hour that Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. From the moment she accepted that first call from Gregory McMichael, she knew she was a willing accessory to the murder. Everything she did after that, she did knowingly furthering the crime. Contacting a corrupt prosecutor who she already had been assured wouldn't prosecute, and then going to the Attorney General's office and telling them that's the guy who should handle the case. She knew that a crime had been committed, and she wanted to make sure the killers got away with it, herself included. In November 2020, Jackie Johnson lost her re-election campaign, and a few weeks after that, George Barnhill's son decided that he wanted to leave her office too, and now he's working in so-called private practice. Jackie Johnson blamed bad publicity from her conspiring to cover up the murder of Ahmaud Arbery for her getting voted out of office. She was right. The people knew what a piece of dirt they had as a DA, and they threw her out. But the problem is the state attorney general's office is proving that they're still loyal to the white supremacist good old boys network. The charges against that woman are just absolutely minuscule. She's got one felony charge of violating her oath of office and a misdemeanor count of hindering a police investigation. That's it. She's looking at one felony, and she's looking at one misdemeanor charge. Everything that she did was just a ton of felonies across the board. Obviously, what this is a cover-up, And they want to make sure that it doesn't go any farther than this. This is meant to be insulation for her against double jeopardy. They're trying to help her out even while pretending that they're going hard on her. They're not at all. Jackie Johnson must go to prison. I mean, she's got to do serious time. But so should that Barnhill creep and his son, and that state attorney general's office needs to be investigated top to bottom, because you know this isn't the first time that they've done something like this. But we know how white supremacy works, especially with the enforcement arm, so the DAs and police are in constant contact because there's no one to punish them for it, or at least that's what they think, because that's how it works 99% of the time. Well, in this case, they were wrong. The family of Ahmaud Arbery have made it their mission to round up and punish everyone involved in his murder. Not just the killers themselves, but all the other people who acted as accessories after the fact, who tried to cover up the murder and prevent the killers from being punished for their crimes. The murderers of Ahmaud Arbery were not just Gregory McMichael, his inbred son, and that malignant, dim-witted buddy. The killers are also the prosecutors who worked after the murder to cover it up. This is yet another in an endless string of examples of why the law and order crap is just a line of bull from liars. There is no law and order in America. There's only white supremacist fiat. Calling out the police and non-uniformed foot soldiers of white supremacy isn't enough. The prosecutors and judges must also be identified, called out, and ultimately punished. Allowing these bastards to simply resign isn't enough, because the inbred son of George Barnhill left Jackie Johnson's office and he's now in private practice. He and his father should be stripped of their law degrees and thrown in a cage. Anything less than that is an insult to the memory of Ahmaud Arbery and all the other victims of anti-black violence. Anything less than that is not justice. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Imani Metajadi, Fatis Mokhtar, Vassal McKenzie, Asha Mwamba, and Sharon Shabala. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.